Hello and welcome to Phenomenoumena. First off, for those people who are just tuning in to hear Ken Shamrock, I have to apologize in this short introduction for the somewhat clickbaity title. I say somewhat because while we were able to speak with Ken, the original plan to have him as our guest for an hour was cut extremely short when we lost the connection to him and could not regain it. I guess it's a sad fact that the internet in 2020 is hardly capable of connecting a few people in different locations around the globe for audio chat. In any case, I apologize on behalf of myself and my co host Ray, but we are still happy to have had Ken for the few minutes we had him here. We put the Ken recording away in the vault. We actually interviewed him back in August 2019 in the lead up to the first Valor Bare Knuckle event, which Ken was promoting. But the recording ended up being short because of the technical problems, and we were unsure of what to do with it. But in that connection, I have heard that the event was a success, so congratulations to Ken on that. When Ken was the, I believe, official spokesperson for the UFC back in the 90s, when politicians were trying to shut the organization and the sport down, he defended it in a well-spoken manner and with entirely persuasive arguments that many people found counterintuitive. So our plan was to discuss with Ken counterintuitive ideas related to the fighting arts and then branch out from there to counterintuitives in general. I wasn't happy just sitting on the recording. I've been an MMA fan since its inception. Well, at least its American inception with the UFC. And I watched Ken fight for over a decade, both on television and in person. So I really wanted to bring the recording to the podcast. And what we finally decided to do was to share with you the small portion during which Ken was with us, and then to carry on the counterintuitive theme by ourselves. So what follows is our recording with Ken and a new recording made this year. Also, if by chance Ken is listening, we thank you for joining us, apologize for the problems, and wish you well with your future projects. Also, here in Tokyo, I spoke with Mr. Funaki recently, and he always has only good things to say about you, and he told me to give you his regards. Thank you. Okay, everyone, please welcome to the podcast Ken Shamrock. And welcome, Ken. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, welcome, Ken.
Well, hey, appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm Gino, and I'm in Tokyo, Japan. And my co-host Ray is in New York.
Oh, okay.
Hello, Ken. I'm Ray.
How you doing, man?
I'm very excited to be speaking with you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Who's in Tokyo?
That's me, Gino.
What are you doing there?
I'm working all kinds of stuff. Do you remember William Colosimo?
Sounds familiar.
He's interviewed you a few times about your career in Japan.
Okay.
I work as his translator for talking to the Japanese guys about that, about Pancrase and Fujiwara and all of that.
Got it. Okay.
So I saw UFC 1 live, and I also covered your last fights in Pride here in Japan as a reporter. So I've really followed your career, from pioneer MMA fighter and trainer to UFC spokesperson, and all the way up to today where you're blazing another trail with Valor, a bare knuckle boxing promotion. Could you tell us about how that came about and what your goals are with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Back in the day when I fought Pancrase and then, of course, into the UFC where it was no rules, bare knuckle, it was just, I felt it was just that pureness. I mean, I remember the adrenaline rush I got when watching Gerardo go out there and just punch that sumo guy in the face and kick him. And I just thought to myself, wow, this is real. It don't get no more real than this. And I remember I had my fight, even though it wasn't submissions, but it was still that bare knuckle, right? It was bare knuckle, no gloves.
Yeah.
And I just thought, man, there was just that rush and that pureness that I felt. And I thought to myself, man, this is, I love this. And then all of a sudden, this guy Tank Abbott comes in here, puts on some 4-ounce gloves and starts knocking people out. And I thought to myself, like, okay, these 4-ounce bare knuckle gloves that people were going to start wearing now. And I said, oh, okay, I'll give it a shot. Well, the minute I start putting those gloves on, I go, okay, this is just not, it almost felt like cheating, right? Like I could put a glove on now and I don't have to be a good striker. I don't have to be able to hit my mark. I could just throw it and hit wherever I want. And then, of course, with the submissions,
Right.
it was real difficult to be able to do rear naked chokes or even to be able to do heel hooks or toe hooks because that glove gets in the way of where your wrists are supposed to be. It's that bulkiness. So it's just not as sweet.
Right.
And so I thought to myself, man, it felt wrong. Like it just like didn't feel right. And the way that they were marketing it was to protect the fighters. And I was like, they're not protecting the fighters. They're protecting the fighters that are winning so they can come back and fight again in 10, 15, 20 minutes. It had nothing to do with safety of it. It just had to do with.
And that's where we lost the connection to Ken Shamrock. It's unfortunate because he was an excellent spokesperson for the UFC, defending the UFC against various politicians and pundits back in the day. It's sad that it doesn't seem any or much of that footage has survived. I was hoping to try to point our guests to, some of the debates that he had on TV about the safety of the UFC, especially compared to other high impact or combat sports. And so I thought, well, one of the interesting things that he brought up time and time again, the people that were arguing against the UFC, calling it a blood sport, and that, we had reverted to ancient Rome and so on, they thought it was truly uncivilized that the fighters in the UFC were not wearing gloves, like boxing gloves. And through, Ken's experience in fighting, he was trained in boxing, in wrestling, and later through his connections to Japan, to submission, to the type of pro wrestling before it became a circus, when it was it was taking amateur wrestling and just starting to make money by doing it, and things like submissions and combining the striking arts and the grappling arts. So anyway, he argued, and thinking about it, it absolutely makes sense, but boxing gloves are there not to protect the head of the opponent, but to protect your own hands so that you can punch the person in the head more. And of course, that's going to lead, as often happens with boxers later in life, they get CTE and they become, what we used to call punch drunk. They basically start exhibiting, dementia-like symptoms very early in life because of the way that the boxing gloves allowed the opponent to hit that person, hundreds and hundreds of times. If you take the gloves off, your hands are actually quite delicate, and you have to be very careful about where you strike. For example, if you're trying to hit a person in the head, there's a lot of parts on the head that are harder than the fist, and you're just going to break your hand. So without the gloves, you have to be more careful about where you hit, and you also have to hit more gently in order to maintain, to make sure that your hands don't break. And that was just one of the sort of counterintuitive ideas that Ken Shamrock brought up in the debates when he was defending the UFC. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I have to admit, I had no idea that that was the case.
Yeah.
And it only goes to show how uninformed intuition
Mm-hmm.
can really lead you astray.
Right. Yeah, I would say another lesson from Ken Shamrock, and of course people like Royce Gracie, another counterintuitive that we found in MMA, or NHB as it was called before MMA, was that in a lot of ways, ground fighting, grappling defeated striking. There was, everyone talked, like on the playground or whatever, about, how so-and-so was just, so fast, he could, punch and kick like lightning. And no one ever thought that a grappler would be able to get in close on someone like that. But then, the first couple of UFCs were won by a strictly, grappling only fighter.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. It reminds me, a friend of my family when I was a kid was a wrestling coach, and my stepfather thought that he was just talking complete nonsense when he said a really well-trained wrestler is more likely than not going to be able to outfight someone who has a black belt in their standard like karate or taekwondo.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. I mean, wrestling training is actually really grueling. I think wrestling training might be like the number one thing that would get a person used to kind of being in the midst of kind of violent, spectacular situation. A person in like a, strip mall taekwondo dojo, or dojang as they would say in Korean, might just fall apart, when things turned violent. But I don't think that's true for the type of grueling wrestling training that they do.
Yeah, that's a whole other level to it. I mean, I remember when I was training, I did 2 levels of certification for scuba diving, and I remember the first time I actually went in the water, with the scuba gear, and I used up my air so fast because I was breathing so fast
Well,
because the environment was just so alien to me.
right, yeah.
And it was kind of similar to when I started doing jujitsu, and I was grappling with this Hungarian guy, and he was sitting on my chest, and he was like 230 pounds or something, and really strong.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, it was a similar kind of feeling of just, oh my God, I got to get out of here. It's like, this is doom. And you just can't summon any skills at that point.
Right. It reminds me of there was someone, I think his last name is Lehman, and I think he became a black belt in BJJ, but he never went into MMA. And I guess he was talking, a lot of garbage about Royce Gracie, and one of Royce's one of
You just know that's a
one of Royce's students, the famous MMA fighter Matt Serra, kind of took him to task, and he said, you're talking stuff about Royce, who made the UFC, who fought MMA, and you've never fought MMA. You're like an expert swimmer who's never gotten in the pool.
Right. It's exactly like what I was talking about with scuba.
Right.
It's one of the reasons they say also, if students are preparing to take an exam,
Yeah.
you should try to, as closely as possible, create the actual conditions under which they'll be taking the exam.
Yeah, that makes sense. The one thing, I certainly don't mean to criticize Ken Shamrock too much, but one thing that he was kind of infamous for is that he was an absolute monster in the gym. I mean, no one could beat him. But when it came time to actually fight in the UFC or something, his results were a little disappointing. And most people who had trained against him in the gym couldn't understand it. And recently, I read an interview with another MMA fighter, Bas Rutten, and he said that the main difficulty in the whole thing is, sorry, I should say, the interview was conducted by William Colosimo, and Bas said that changeover from like the gym to the arena is actually the toughest thing, the toughest part of the whole thing. And I thought that was interesting. And then recently I watched backstage footage of Nobuhiko Takada as he was making his way into the ring to fight Rickson Gracie at Pride 1. I should also say, being here in Japan, I was actually an MMA reporter for a number of years, and I covered probably about 20 of the Pride events live. And it was an absolutely amazing spectacle, and you felt like you were watching history be made every event they held. But anyway, in this backstage footage, it was absolutely intense beyond belief. Like, sometimes I actually get like a little nervous when we hit the record button to start recording the podcast. But then here was this guy Takada going out into this sea of 90,000 people to put his physical health and, maybe even more on the line in like a one-on-one fight where you didn't really know what was going to happen. You didn't really know what the opponent was going to do, what kind of skills they brought, and so on. And I mean, yeah, I guess it totally makes sense that, there's this huge difference, when it comes to gym fighting versus fighting in that kind of event. Maybe that was just sort of counterintuitive for me.
No, but the thing is, a lot of things that are counterintuitive, they make sense upon reflection.
Right. Right.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, if you can actually play a Paganini piece on guitar,
Hmm.
and that's the apex of what you can do, that's probably not what you should actually do when you go to perform live.
Right. One thing that you mentioned when we were gearing up to do this podcast, you had said that every instinct that we have in fighting is the opposite of what you should actually do.
Yeah, we that's definitely something I experienced. I mean,
Mhm.
this goes to kind of the, the idea that most people actually think they're better fighters than they really are.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to bring that up. You get the sense that, well, the thing with this podcast, right, is we're starting with that counterintuitive notion that, the gloves are not there to protect the head in boxing. And we thought it would be good to use that as a kind of launch point to get into all kinds of counterintuitives in life and to look at intuition and so on. But anyway, yeah, with the idea that, everyone thinks they're a better fighter than they are. There's a sense in general, like everyone just seems to naturally think that they know everything. And part of that, I think, is that intuition is always kind of there to provide an answer. But it turns out that for a lot of situations, the answer that intuition gives is really shoddy. It's total crap. It's wrong. The idea that everyone, thinks that they can fight is a good example of that.
Right. It reminds me also of Clausewitz on war,
Uh-huh.
and I forget, someone was discussing Clausewitz, but it's one idea is war isn't just something that you wage on someone else.
Uh-huh.
War is something that you do, and then someone else does something back.
Right.
And it's not always obvious. What you expect them to do in return is not necessarily what they will do.
Right. Right. Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, an untrained person basically does every single thing wrong in fighting. That's the truth. So if a person who is untrained thinks that they can fight, they're just extremely deluded. That reminds me of Kathryn Schulz. She wrote this awesome book called Being Wrong. And in it, she asks how it feels to be wrong. And she says that people usually tell her it feels awful or paralyzing or something like that. But that's actually the answer to a different question. That's how it feels to find out you were wrong about something. But how it actually feels to be wrong is just simply perfectly normal. You don't feel anything at all. And so that is our lot in many, if not most situations. We're blind to the fact that we don't know, and we're blind to the fact that we don't have the answer. We think we have the answer, but it's wrong. We think we know how to fight, but all we know how to do is get beat up. The connection to Socrates is obvious, but I don't know if we want to go that deep.
Well, if you want to know the truth, I have the Republic here. Like, and another thing I did was I got my copy of the book The Tree of Knowledge,
What's that?
because the Tree of Knowledge it's basically a book which is a theory of consciousness that goes down to the cellular level.
Huh.
I don't want to go off on too long of a tangent. I mean, we touched on it a little bit before, but one of the things one of the things that they argue is that we see the way that we see.
Right.
We are organisms that are conditioned. I mean, when they take it down to like a cellular level, they talk about an organism has some kind of metabolic hum. There's something going on inside the organism, and then some sense data. It's when it's coming into the organism, it in some way perturbs that metabolic hum.
Hmm.
So that, like, that experience of perception has to do with just the way that organism functions. It just creates a change in the organism. So it has much more to do with the nature of the organism than whatever caused the change in the organism.
Right.
So we see the way that we see. So it's kind of similar to the idea of like Kant's thing in itself,
right,
versus the perception. So I broke that book out, and I'd remember one of the things that there are exercises for you to do in the book to become aware of your perceptual limitations.
Mm-hmm.
And I had done one before where you have it's basically a cross on one side of the page, and on the other side of the page is a black circle. The diameter is a little over an inch. And if you hold the book about 15 inches from your face, you cover your left eye and just stare with your right eye at the cross.
Uh-huh.
In a little while, you'll stop seeing the black circle on the other side of the page.
Mm-hmm.
And that reveals the blind spot that you actually have in your eye.
Right. Which is something like 17 moons large.
Yeah, it's really crazy. It's really crazy. And then even that, like I was thinking like, oh yeah, I'm going to break that. I just want to do that again just to get myself in the right mindset. And I was doing it. And even that I thought would be easier to do. And I was holding the book and staring at the cross, and it wasn't happening.
Huh.
And then I was like, oh. So I broke out my tape measure and said, okay, let's actually measure out 15 inches here.
Right.
And so I adjusted the distance, and then it happened pretty quickly. So even there, it was, there was a stumbling block to even find the blind spot.
Right. So yeah, we definitely have to watch for those blind spots, and in Plato's Apology, there's that line, I neither know nor think that I know. So we really have to get into a spot of just total perplexity where we realize that we know absolutely nothing, that almost the entire thing is a blind spot. And then we can find revelations and growth.
Right. I mean, it reminds me in a Socratic dialogue, they asked, can an ideal city come to be? And Socrates replied, if philosophers become kings or kings philosophers. And we see the way that our socio-political dynamics function in the situation we're in now, where being very certain and being, as deeply lost in ignorance as I think is even possible, has been functioning.
Yeah. One thing I thought of when we were going to do this, when I was thinking about intuition, it seems that, of course, in the political realm as well, but a lot of speech and debate techniques seem to take advantage of the fact that intuition is always there to give an answer to us. So like that, a person can say things that seem right intuitively, but it's just sort of leading you down the wrong path. It could be factually wrong. It could be a logical error, whatever. But as long as it kind of, has that intuitive ring to it, the person can win you over with it.
Right. I mean, this is why I think it's good to research logical fallacies.
Yeah.
And also keep in mind that a person could be committing a logical fallacy, not because they're not aware of it, but because they're assuming that you're not aware of it.
Right. This really reminds me of, I'm not much of a bestseller guy, but I did read this one. I've read a few of them, like Freakonomics and that kind of thing. One of them, Daniel Kahneman wrote this book. I think it's called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, something like that. And the idea there is that basically the brain works in two different systems. And system one is this fast system that we default to that just uses heuristics and gut feelings, and it just kind of tries to flip an answer out there as quickly as possible. And in whatever situation it is, if it's a situation that isn't, life or death, it's one where we can, learn from our mistake, then we only switch then to system 2, which is a slow system where actual thinking and reflection comes in. With these two systems of sort of fast twitch, intuitional voodoo magic thinking, and then a kind of more rational, reflective thinking, there's two systems, there's probably a Pareto curve. Like if you were to map how much time people spend working in system 2, you'd probably find there's a few people that are almost always in a kind of deeply reflective thinking mode. And you would find that the vast majority of the people are not typically there. They're not slowing down and going like, wait, let me figure out if this actually adds up. They're just like, sure, I know.
Yeah, I've had experiences with both that left a real strong impression on me. In cases that involved moving something. One was like I was kind of like groggy and had to move something, but I didn't really think it through. And, I was picking something up and the cord was still it was like I think it was a air conditioner. And the cord was still on the wall, and it's just like the other person was like, "Wait, what are you doing?" And I was just kind of just like, I just want to get this over with as fast as possible. It's just like, well, person's like, "What the hell is going on?" And another situation, I don't remember all the details, but I remember I was moving something with these two guys. Sometimes when you're moving stuff, there's an element of machismo that comes into play.
Yeah.
And it can really be dangerous because they were trying to get something into an elevator. And I said, "Hey, let's slow down a minute." And then I was talking and I could see the one guy was like, "I'm tired of listening to this guy talk. This is so ridiculous. Let's just get on with it." And he's like, "Come on." And the next thing you know, his hand was ripped open. It was like bleeding all over the place. But I could see like their eyes getting glazed over. It's just like, oh, he's talking. It sounds like academic mumbo jumbo. This is just one of those guys. And, the next thing you know, the guy's hand is bleeding.
Yeah.
And it's like, so I've seen it from both sides, kind of like one was being kind of groggy and just being like, God damn it, I don't want to do this. I got to do this thing. Let's just do it. And then just doing it like a fool.
Yeah.
And the other was when I was in a more, reflective, deeper state of consciousness. And I was working with two like macho idiots who then, one of them got badly injured.
Right.
But even here, I just referred to them as two macho idiots. Maybe in the other circumstance, someone thought I was just being like some kind of macho idiot.
Yeah.
Or maybe just an idiot.
Well, to make a quick segue back to, I think we're going to go into some counterintuitive examples, kind of similar to the, martial arts and fighting is, the NFL, all of the padding and helmets they wear.
Right.
The sport is this like huge crunching impacts, this crazy dangerous spectacle of like huge guys, in like metal helmets or whatever they are. It's like train collisions or giant missiles fired at each other. I saw a recent brain scan research that, more than half of NFL players have CTE. So their brains are just degenerating into dementia because of all of the impacts from this crazy, dangerous spectacle. And of course, you'd think, the padding and helmets there are there to protect them. But all it does is allow them, to hit each other harder, more injuries.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense that's, it's kind of like the situation with the gloves.
Right, exactly.
Where it just creates more kind of abandon. And if I start, I'm thinking now, because I've never really, the closest I've ever really been to football is I had a girlfriend who liked football.
Yeah.
And it was like, it was a complete reversal. Oh, I want to watch football. I'm like, oh God, you're going to make me sit and watch football with you.
Right. Yeah.
But it made more sense to me for a woman to want to watch football because like all the stuff that they wear, it kind of amplifies the masculinity.
Right. Yeah. Definitely.
Of the player. So, but thinking about it now, the helmet, the padding, and everything, what is being done there to protect the neck?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not a real football fan. It's crazy how it's been, put into this like sort of you get that ultra masculine thing going on, and now they've attached that to the military where they have all these bombers flying over the NFL events and such.
Right.
And I think I read that it's usually like, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, when it's aired on TV, but the play time is something like 11 minutes. So you're just watching lines being drawn or whatever. It's actually an interesting phenomenon, but it's as far as being a fan of it or knowing what kind of equipment they're using, I couldn't give an answer there.
Yeah, I don't. But just visualizing what I've seen, it sounds like you're just setting it up that a head is more likely to impact harder in such a way that's more likely to cause a neck injury because there's nothing really protecting the neck.
Right. Yeah, I've read a lot of news stories about high school football and athletes being paralyzed and stuff like that. It's kind of almost astounding that we accept the sport.
Yeah, it never really resonated with me. I had people explain it to me that it doesn't resonate with me because I just don't understand it. And I'm willing to concede that I don't understand it.
Right.
And I mean, I don't have that much else to say about it other than to me, it seems like it wouldn't be worth the risk. But it just made me think of another thing, which is uh, I think some people are disgruntled feeling that, a lot of athletes are just overpaid.
Yeah.
But then I'm looking at it from another perspective. I'm wondering these guys, with what you're describing, with their brain scans and also just all the other types of injuries they have, to their joints and to their skeletons in general.
Right.
What state those guys are in when they're like 45.
Yeah. There's probably only a lucky few that kind of get out of it relatively unscathed.
And then, another thing I've got to wonder about is how well do these guys manage their money? And then, is there someone else who's actually managing their money? And then, is it, like how often is somebody, kind of halfway to being crippled and, suffering from the onset of dementia and also finds out that he doesn't have any more money?
Right. He's got to sell his life-size gold-plated panther to pay for the hospital bills.
I mean, just, I know that's been the case also with a lot of performers,
Yeah.
who were going on tour and they were being ripped off the whole time because they didn't have their eye on the money.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But it just shows that so many things are just not what you think they are.
Right. I think that, well, it's almost like all we ever get are faint impressions because we're not really very conscious and never give anything really great attention. And so, yeah, we never really know what a thing is. And then a lot of times intuition comes and sort of paints over that whole thing with some kind of spotty answer or whatever. And like it reminds me in the Delicate War I wrote about, there's this huge group of studies that found that over 75% of people can't draw a bicycle, and a bicycle is probably one of the most viewed objects in daily life, but you really get that sense that it's viewed but not really seen. I would recommend anyone listening to give it a try drawing a bicycle, and if you Google bad bicycle drawings, you'll see what I mean about that. But the part of the problem is, I think that intuition is kind of undernourished and that you can feed it better. Like to go back to, fighting, it's like when you just start training and you know nothing and you just kind of rely on your intuition, you do everything absolutely wrong. But as you train and learn the art, you develop a kind of fight intelligence or fight sense, which is intuition running better because it's been properly fed. So I think there's this kind of interesting divide It might just be two reasons, or it might be more, but for a situation to be counterintuitive, the situation might just be incompatible with however intuition works, or it might be counterintuitive because we just haven't given our intuition enough nourishment.
Yeah, well, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I mean, I can think of two examples. One is when I trained some Brazilian jiu-jitsu at one dojo, and then one of the guys was also teaching mixed martial arts, and there were some strikes that, like these striking patterns that we were repeating.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, one, it was just so exhausting, where it's like jab, cross, hook, and like, oh, I'm gonna, were points where I'm just like, I hope no one's looking and seeing that I'm actually not doing this right now. It kind of like this, like, what can I get away with not doing? But what they were doing, and I realized it when I was coming home one night, all of a sudden I just threw like, 5 punches really fast. And thought, oh, they're basically almost, writing this, like they're encoding this into my moving center, into my body, so that it happens automatically, so that I can strike and do things, and that it's actually writing a kind of proper algorithm.
Right.
So that's an example, and I think that's part of what you're talking about. Another example is someone actually asked me a question from that Kahneman book, that, what was it, like Thinking Fast, Thinking Slowly?
Yeah.
And he asked me a question. I don't remember the exact question, but it was a math question. And he looked at me and he kind of had this like syrupy smile and his eyes started squinting. and he said something like, I can tell you the right answer later if you want to hear it. And then I basically just looked at him and I explained how someone would get it wrong and what the right answer was.
Uh-huh.
Because it was like middle school math. And so in that particular case, I could tell that this guy, he didn't know what to do, because, there was some like element of feeling like he had a moment of feeling powerful or whatever, but it was just like, this is ridiculous. But it only goes to show that I was prepared for that question, because my mind is like, has more training in that direction.
Right. Yeah. I actually want to make a point very related to that. So I wonder if you would want to go into the string girdling problem.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, so the idea is that this comes from Wittgenstein. If you have a rope around the earth, if you add an extra yard or what have you, how much is that going to add to the distance above the earth? In other words, say I've got a string around the equator. If I add, let's say a meter. If I add a meter, then how far above the surface of the earth would the string rise if it's all evened out?
Right.
And it's very counterintuitive, because what would you think? You would think it would be virtually nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
right.
However many, thousands of, kilometers around the earth is, and then you're just adding a meter onto the string.
Right. So it seems like it would be really negligible. So I thought about it. If you write it as the circumference is equal to 2 pi r,
Mm-hmm.
then all you're saying is that I'm adding some value x. So x could be a meter, like what we're talking about. It could be 10 meters,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So then you rewrite c plus x would equal 2 pi r plus x. And then if I want to know how far above the surface of the earth the string would actually rise, I'd want to get a new figure for my radius, right?
Yeah.
So I want to get 2 pi by itself, again, times something in parentheses that I'm multiplying. And if I do that, I get 2 pi times r plus x over 2 pi.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're talking about whatever your x value is, divide that by 2 pi, and that's how far above the surface of the Earth it will rise.
Yeah. And so that extra meter translates into, at any location along the Earth, the string is actually 16 centimeters above the Earth, right?
Yeah, that should be right. Hold on 1 second. I mean, I can actually compute this. Yeah, I'm getting 1.57, 1 divided by 2 pi.
So just about
Let me see.
16, right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, that's entirely counterintuitive. And I seem to recall there's actually another counterintuitive aspect about this. I think when I first heard the problem, I did the same exact thing that you did. I went in and calculated it. I looked up the circumference of the Earth and all of that. But what it seemed to me, looking at the equations, is that, like, if you were to take like a tennis ball, right, and put a
Oh,
string
hold on
around
a
it.
second. I made a mistake.
Oh,
It should be 0.159.
159. Okay.
So you said 16 centimeters, right?
Yeah. So it's like
Yeah, so
15.9.
that would be 0.159. But I was thinking there was a decimal issue, but I just made a mistake before with the calculator because I put in 1 divided by 2 pi without putting parentheses around it.
Uh-huh.
So it was 1/2 times pi.
Right. Yeah.
Because I realized, well, wait a minute, that's not just a decimal issue. That's a little bit off. So that was just another example. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it was like, that's another mistake.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it would be 0.159. So that would be just under 16 centimeters. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Right. So if you do the exact same thing with a tennis ball and you make the string 1 meter longer than it should be, then how far at each point on the tennis ball, how far away will the string be? And I seem to recall that it's actually the same 15.9 centimeters.
Yeah, it's got to be exactly the same because here again, the radius has no bearing. What the radius is that you're working with has no bearing. Either way, whatever your radius is, you're going to get 2 pi times r plus x over 2 pi. So whatever I add to r, right? Whatever I add to the 2 pi r, when I factor out the 2 pi, I'm going to get x divided by 2 pi, irrespective of whether it's the Earth or a tennis ball or a golf ball, which
Right.
is just no. See here, this is one of the things. I know this is true because I'm looking at an equation and I know that that's the answer. I'm used to that being the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So I can go into an abstract representation and that's how I will figure it out. And I know that that's right. But it doesn't actually make sense to me.
Yeah.
I just know, just know that it's right. Like, is that right? Yeah, it's got to be. Because then you're saying, well, yeah, what if it's a tennis ball? No, well, no matter what, it's going to be x divided by 2 pi.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, that's doubly counterintuitive, right? And then
yeah,
on the point that you made about how, because of your math background, that you were like better prepared for that math problem that was brought to you from the Daniel Kahneman book. I remember there was a Brian Eno interview where he brought up this string around the Earth puzzle. And I guess he likes asking different people what they think about it. And he said that the only 2 types of people who usually got it were mathematicians, of course, and then seamstresses, or people who work with clothing. That totally makes sense. I think, for a lot of people, they could relate to that, like if you go up a size in your jeans, just like an extra inch or 2 in the waist, you go from in shape to fat. So if you're used to seeing...
I know. See, I didn't know. Do I know that because I have a math background?
But yeah, so if you're working with cutting fabric for clothing and stuff like that all the time, and you're used to seeing how like small changes in a measurement result in clothing for much larger people, I think that feeds those people's intuition in the kind of the same way as the math does, so that the puzzle is in a way no longer counterintuitive.
Right. Yeah. Because people are used to thinking in a certain way, because they have actually developed a structure in their intelligence
Right.
that isn't just like some, confused mishmash,
Yeah. So one question I have is that if we can feed intuition better, then is there also a way that we can actually improve the intuitional power itself? Like if you learn math, right, then you're kind of getting healthy food to feed the intuition. But then is there some sort of analog to exercise to go along with the healthy food?
Yeah, that's a good question because okay, I guess one obvious thing is so you were saying Brian Eno was asking people and seamstresses and people with mathematical training had an advantage.
Right.
But then the question is, what if you asked those people a different type of question where they weren't necessarily prepared for it? Would they have any advantage at all?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, does that improvement in their intuition help with the intuition in general?
Right.
And I suspect that it might a little bit because I think part of the exercise might go back to the Kahneman book, which is stopping and thinking slowly.
Right. Yeah. I'm also reminded of, on IQ tests, there are those, I think they're called Raven's matrices.
Right.
There's a certain type of puzzle on there. And when I was playing around with, just some of those types of questions, when I first saw the type of question, I was a little bit dumbfounded. It wasn't really gelling with me. Like it wasn't making intuitional sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
But once I played around with those problems, they became easier and easier. So there was a way, right, in which I was feeding my intuition through repetition of those types of problems, and they became easier. And I guess that's a kind of big criticism that you could lay on those types of questions as used in IQ tests, because just simple familiarity with the type of problem can greatly increase the types of scores that people would get.
Oh, yeah. I was listening to a podcast discussion today where this woman said it was an experiment they did with a group of people that pretty much had the same GPA. Like they checked for a number of parameters saying, okay, so we would expect basically the same performance between these two groups.
Mm,
And there were certain intellectual exercises. They split them up into two groups, and certain intellectual exercises that were similar to the IQ test were done with one group, and then they
mm.
scored higher on the IQ test.
All right. Well, there you go.
Yeah, it's I took I mean, it wasn't a real IQ test, but it was one of these BS online IQ tests. But some of the problems were kind of real. I mean,
Yeah.
you had to think to figure out the answer, and
Right.
there was one problem. I it wasn't a Ravens matrix, but it was it was some kind of a pattern, and I looked at the pattern and I could almost see the object moving and could see where it was headed. Like I could see what the
Uh-huh.
trajectory, I could see what was going on in the pattern. And I got that right. And I thought about it and I realized it was very, very similar to a diagram I had been looking at in a science textbook. So, yeah, but this is a highly politicized topic. I mean, in a certain respect, I think that IQ tests can be thought of as rhetorical weapons.
Mm, yeah. Well, there's definitely, some interesting cultural aspects to think about, when familiarity can, increase test score.
Sure. Yeah.
Obviously the questions and answers are going to be framed in various ways that reflect the culture of the people that are making the questions. I did a crappy IQ test online, and it was probably worse than I could have ever imagined that online IQ tests were. The first question was like who the men are on Mount Rushmore.
No.
Yeah.
That's so ridiculous. They could have asked some other question about some, famous, some temple that's famous to people in some specific country.
Yeah.
Like what, or like what totem animal is found here or something. But the thing is, I think, well, that touches on something. And this is, I saw something recently where they were comparing somebody saying, oh, this man was so smart and his IQ was higher than Einstein's. And they put Einstein, IQ 160, and Isaac Newton. And it said Isaac Newton, IQ 190. And I remembered reading that Einstein said that he had never taken an IQ test. And I'm really sure that Isaac Newton never took an IQ test.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
I mean, you hear people do this all the time where they'll say, "Oh yeah, like somebody did this and this person has an even higher IQ than Einstein." What are you
Right.
talking about? And we've created this whole culture of people that, I mean, they just don't know what they're talking about. And I spent some time in Korea, and Korean kids are always doing practice IQ questions.
Yeah.
Things related to IQ like problems. And I don't know what the exact statistics are, but I have a hunch that Korean IQs are going to be pretty high.
I have the same hunch.
So, but I think one of the issues is that it's exactly the there are also these math competitions where there are these math puzzles and so forth that, or like these engineering problems, and it's like people develop a knack for doing those types of problems, but then that doesn't necessarily map over that much to practical problems that people in a related field would actually be doing. So it creates this whole rabbit hole of things that can be thought-provoking but are actually not taking you, do you know what I mean, that much closer to anywhere.
Right. You get like someone like lays a bunch of matches on a table and tells you to move one and change it from one number to another. And then you have this other situation where you've got to make sure that like pipes don't leak oil into the ocean.
Right. I mean, some of that stuff can be good, but I also like, I also like stuff where that you have problems that you're doing where you're taking a limit in pre-calc and you don't know that you're actually looking at the definition of the derivative, and then later it's introduced to you, oh, that thing that you were doing, that's actually the definition of the derivative and so forth. Whereas like each step that you take is actually a step towards something. The thing with the IQ tests also, and, kind of training people to deal with certain types of patterns, and then they kind of have a leg up on somebody. That exists in this preconceived system where you're used to running over that ground. And I'm not sure how well that would actually prepare you to deal with something unforeseen.
Right. Yeah. I just wanted to move back to the string around the Earth problem for a second, because there's something that's kind of related and kind of counterintuitive that I figured I'd bring up. And that's that, like, if we sort of think intuitively in pictures of, the distance from the lowest ocean floor to the highest mountain, it seems like the surface of the Earth is just incredibly craggy and uneven.
Right.
But the lowest place on the ocean floor and the top of Mount Everest, if you measure the difference, it's a bit over 12 miles, but the diameter of the Earth is almost 8,000 miles. So the surface of the Earth is about 1/8% of the diameter, which is only about half the proportion of the skin of an apple to the apple itself. So if you shrunk the Earth down to the size of an apple, the elevation deviations from the bottom of the ocean to the top of the tallest mountain would all take place within what would be the outside 50% of the skin of the apple.
Yeah, that's a nice thought exercise. It reminds me of a problem I gave to my students in space mathematics, which is to count the different escape velocities from the lowest point accessible to the highest point accessible. And that was like the geographic North Pole and the peak of Mount, I think it's called Chimborazo in Ecuador. And it's almost exactly the same. Like, I had one of my students do it, and then she put, where it's like a wavy equal sign, and then it says equal, like, the same, like, like writing it as a quotient is roughly equal to 1. And I was like, no, give me like some decimal, because it's, it's got to be some difference that we have to put in there. But it's like, 99 something, whatever, percent. But it's something that they talk about in the fourth way. We have a very limited sense of proportion.
Yeah. Well, I thought that I'd bring up that the surface of the Earth thing, because it's also a repuking lesson. Because I think in the 80s or 90s, there was a physics writer that said the Earth was actually smoother than a billiard ball. Like if you shrunk it down to the same size.
Right.
But it's actually not. It's less smooth than a billiard ball, despite being really, really smooth.
Yeah. Well, no, the repuking issue is definitely something you want to take into account.
Well, so we went from a Ken Shamrock interview about bare knuckle fighting to counterintuitive geometry and some other things. I think that's about it for today. But I would really like to do a part 2 to this and see how far we can push things. I think we should give some more examples and talk about the intuition itself, about the subconscious, and about how we might give more nourishment or exercise to the intuition. For my part, I'd like to talk about how intuition fits into our toolbox of ways of knowing and its strengths and weaknesses, and then to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of a few other types of ways of knowing, including rationality. I think we can bring up some powerful examples of how effective intuition can also be. So do you want to just try to wing the outro and see what happens?
Yeah, I think winging the outro is a good idea.
We could say, if we were going to record an outro, then maybe we should say this and that.
Yeah, like you've been listening to Phenomenoumena with co-hosts Ray, I am he,
and Gino. Yeah, well, we could do it like that.
Yeah, and then we could direct them to all the places where the podcast would be found. Spotify, iTunes, wherever they are. And, check out our webpage, Phenomenoumena.com. What about using this? Can we use this?
Yeah, I think maybe we should use this.